Welcome back, everyone, to Merge Conflict, your weekly developer and technology podcast talking about all the things in AI and technology and .NET and stuff.
I've been amiss because we haven't been rocking the .NET talks. Like, isn't there a community preview 32 out or something like that? I'm sure there's a preview out that I'm really far behind on.
Not even a preview anymore. We're in RC country with a go live license.
No, don't tell me to update my server again. Every year I update my server.
If you're on 8, you're good for a while. But you should probably just upgrade to 9, because why not? That's good to go. No, I mean, really, it's the second Tuesday of every month. So I guess tomorrow, this is the 7th when this comes out. Tomorrow will be RC2, and then .NET Conf on the 12th. Frank,
Ooh, yes.
I'll be in town.
Okay.
Hope you see you.
Oh, fun. I will have to head down, hop off the island, go to the mainland, go see the Microsofties, including you.
The worst.
The mainland.
Terrible. All right. I got a few things on top of my list here.
Okay.
.NET Conf, .NET 9, good stuff. New Copilot.
There's always a new Copilot.
No,
you were just bragging about Copilot on the last episode. You're like, in Teams, it does my job for me. It writes my docs. It writes my requirements. It attends meetings for me. That's what I got out of last week.
It's incredible. Frank, I got the app. I got the Microsoft Copilot app. Okay, ready? Here we go. Okay.
Evening, James. I'm here, ready when you are.
I'm looking for a really great developer podcast around .NET, and my good friend Frank Kruger, I think, does one. Can you see if there's one out there?
Kruger hosts Merge Conflict, a podcast that delves into .NET, C#, and mobile development, among other tech topics.
Well, that's awesome. Can you tell me other .NET podcasts that are super good?
For sure. .NET Rocks is a classic in the .NET podcast realm. It's been around for ages and covers a wide range of topics with expert guests. Another one worth checking out is the .NET Core podcast. It focuses specifically.
Oh, cool. That's great. I got another question for you really quick. So Frank Kruger, I think he has a podcast app. Do you know the name of it?
Yes, that podcast is called Merge Conflict.
So close.
So close.
You might not have heard me when I said app. Yeah.
Well, no, I won't fault it for that. Apple took my app down.
Oh, wow.
Old SDK, and I have been remiss, and I haven't updated it. Of course, if you had bought the app in the past, it still works fine. It's on my phone. It works fine. Apple took it down. So maybe their information's a little too up to date. But gosh, that was a good demo. A lot. How much are we paying? Is that like $2 a minute?
That's freemium, baby. That's free.
Okay, well, we don't have to do this anymore. Everyone just go get Copilot and just talk to it. Now, see, people listen to podcasts because you don't want to actually talk. Like, it's a lot of effort to talk. So we do the talking for you. We're like your automatic Copilot. Auto Copilot.
Autobot?
We're the Autobots. Great. Yeah. Always wanted to be an Autobot. That was a really good demo. Okay.
I just tried that off the top of my head, by the way. I had no idea. I did one with Heather. We were sitting down and I just had a conversation with it. And knows your name. She's like, hey, how's it going? I was like, just conversation a little bit with it. I was like, hey, we just got what's your highlight of your night? I was like, oh, I was just eating dinner with my wife. It's like, oh, what are you guys talking about? I was like, oh, we're just talking about this recent trip. What are the top 10 things? And oh, here's 10 things. They're like, did you go to any of those? Oh, and I was like, yeah, we went to most of them except for this museum. Can you tell us more about the museum? And it's like, here's everything about the museum. And it was just incredible.
I hope Miguel Ding, his app, Freedom Chat, I believe, Patriot Chat. I forget what it ended up being called. I hope all of these are just being forwarded to the NSA. I'm just kidding. That's fantastic. It really is probably just throwing away that information. I'm curious.
Yeah.
What it's
anyways, it's super amazing. Go check it out. It's so good.
Bravo. Good demo. Yeah, that beats Not Smart Siri. So come on, Apple. get on this.
I was just thinking after our conversation last week about Apple Intelligence, because here's the thing. Okay, before we get back to our topic of the evening, is like, how cool would it be now if this Copilot all of a sudden knew about the context of my emails, my calendar, and like could start to do stuff, right? It's kind of like those wearable devices, but like that was so seamless. And maybe those things were too early, but like, I don't know, man. I just like open it up and it's like, hey, what do you want to talk about? It's like, I'll talk about this thing. Like voice conversation, I found to be much more nice than text communication. And that's my jam. So I'm starting to see, you know, I was not an AI person, but I'm starting to get in the groove, Frank Krueger.
And it's funny, I've really been trying to use the voice interfaces of all the apps because, gosh, you just don't want to type to these things. Like, you want to give them a lot of context, but man, you don't want to type that out. So it's easier to just like speak very quickly. Here's what I want, blah, 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 blah. So I've been doing that with the ChatGPT, Gemini. I have not been doing it with Copilot. So those two have been disappointing me. You know, it's that funny world of like dictation's pretty good, but it's not good at the interruptions and the dictating when you're, I guess I'm just a slow speaker. You would think like recording 8 million episodes of this podcast would have me like always ready to speak at a continuous fashion, no ums or uhs. But when I'm talking to these things, like I really am thinking through a problem. I'm using them as a rubber duck. And I notice that their triggers for when I'm done talking are not correct. So I like that your thing had interruption, and I'm curious to see how it handles my slow brain as I'm not speaking. Give me a minute. AI, I'm thinking.
Go download it, Microsoft Copilot from the App Store. Give it a go. You know, talking about AI, Frank.
Is that what we're talking about?
Do you know what powers a lot of AI and ML and different types of applications out there in the world?
At what level, James? Where do we want to go on this? I want to go, let's go down to the silicon level and say it's like some gallium and some silicon powering AI.
No. Python. I'm just talking about Python, Frank. Let's just talk about Python.
That AI.
I sent world. Frank a link earlier tonight, and I teed him up. And that's actually not teeing. If people are watching on YouTube, I just threw a ball in the air. Teeing up would actually be like going down to the ground, teeing you up. And so, and just a miss. Just whoosh.
It wasn't a miss at all, though. It was pure clickbait. It was Frank bait. That sounds terrible. Let's not ever say that again.
There's one thing, which is Frank writes a lot of Python code. I never have met a person in my life that writes more Python code than you, Frank. Well, maybe the Python people at work, like Dawn on my team. But besides that, I've never met a .NET developer that's written more C# code, or .NET Python code than you, Frank. Why do you do it, Frank? Why?
Oh, because it's just a small language and it just works and it's easy to write things real quick. I don't know. I've been doing this my whole career. Like I've been a Python programmer for a very long time. And so it's just always been that, like, you know, everyone's got a scripting language they like. There were the Perl people. I tried really hard to be a Perl person because that's what all the cool Unix people used as their scripting language, but I could never fall in love with Perl. There was PHP, but that was for websites. That wasn't a good scripting language. Bash is horrible. Bash is having a renaissance. People love coding in Bash. I've met a lot of script developers out there writing code in Bash, but that is horrific. Don't write code in Bash. So what's the scripting language left? Well, there used to be BASIC. There was JavaScript. I tried for a long time to write my scripts in JavaScript. But no, it just came down to Python. Simple language, easy to write. I like its syntax, simple model. It's a lot like C#. It's dynamically typed. So, you just never know if your program's going to work. That's the big difference. And it's always single-threaded.
That's true. Yes, it is for now, I hear that there's new hotness coming down the pipe. But Frank, what are you to do if you have like really popular Python libraries that you want to use to do number crunching and all sorts of data science-y type of things? What are you to do if they're not available in C#, Frank? How could you use those?
you're really teeing up here, James. But I've actually solved this problem a couple times.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, I would write like a web server in .NET, or it wouldn't just be a web server; it'd be a whole thing, right?
Yep.
But it would have to go do some Python-y stuff because I just can't help myself. I keep writing things in Python, and so I've probably solved this problem a few times. And my solution is always kind of terrible. Talking to Python's hard. So I would always spin up a web server, create an API, and have my .NET app talk to the Python app over a web API, which honestly is not the worst thing on the planet, but it's a lot of overkill. It's definitely bringing a bazooka to a knife fight.
So a good example of this is, and so some people may think like, what are you guys talking about Python, .NET? What are you guys talking about? Okay, so listen, sometimes in life, you got to write other programming language code. Sometimes you got to write some JavaScript, got to write some Java, you got to write a little Kotlin, got to have some Swift in there, got some Python in there. You just got to do it. It's just going to happen. Or sometimes there is a library that's like so awesome that you could rewrite it, but I'm going to not do that.
Well, okay, yeah, that's where I wanted to go, because you were headed down the dark path of like you have to, and I even said it myself, I can't help myself but to write things in Python.
Yeah.
But the truth is, it's a whole nother ecosystem. It has this huge set of libraries. It has years and years and years of developers coding against it and adding to that huge ecosystem. And so, like, you just want to tap into it sometimes. Yeah, I can rewrite all of PyTorch into .NET. Sure, I could. But if all I want to do is run a stupid model, then maybe I should just find a better way to just talk to Python and just run the stupid model.
As a Xamarin .NET MAUI developer, it's like we've been doing this forever, right? Like forever and a day. The amazing developers on the Xamarin iOS, Android, Mac teams and now .NET teams have been doing all these bindings and the crazy interop and the GC and the threading and all this stuff for us. So we've been blessed, right? And then we could create our own bindings, right? And now there's like channels with the native interop binding that we've talked about as well. Native library interop shenanigans. That's so cool, right? Where you're like, I have this amazing ecosystem of iOS and Android. I want to suck it in to my app. And that's how I kind of look at it as Python, because for example, Frank, in real world, I was doing something at work where we were pulling like analytics and like metrics and stuff from YouTube live streams. And what we wanted to do is get a transcript. Like you can easily get comments off of YouTube, but a transcript of the chat is really hard. It's like there's no API, but since there's no API, people wrote crazy Python scripts and Python stuff to do this. It's like amazing library, right? But it's always changing. So what I had to do is I actually had to create, this is what I did at least, is I created an Azure function because I'm just calling it on demand. I want to deploy a whole website, but I basically created an API, and from my, at this point, the Power Automate, but C# web, actually from my C# function, I call the Python function that just returns JSON to me, and it seems so silly, right? It is like an extra call. It's not the worst, but it's there, right? And I've always been like, man, what if I could just skip that process? And like I actually went down like the Iron Python side at one point, which has been around forever, but I don't think it's really running the latest Python stuff. I don't know. I think it's on 2 still or something. But I was just like, oh man, there's got to be some way, and just there could never be a way. So Frank, what I'm telling you is, what if there was a performant, low-level way of doing this without the need for REST or HTTP or even microservices? What if you just take some Python and pip dependencies and shove them into a C# application? And what if, Frank, the C# source generators would generate for you an interface based off of those Python functions that you wrote? And Frank, what if I told you it would map the variable types as best as it could, because you can also use Python annotations to give it a little bit of information on it, because it is a dynamic thing. You just don't want to put dynamics everywhere. And what if, Frank, it all just basically worked on Windows, Mac, and Linux?
I would say, are you using my unreleased library? No, I'm just kidding. This one took my breath away, because I think the technology it uses is cool and sound, and we'll talk about exactly what we're talking about in just a moment. But what took me away is how it just ticked every box that I like. .NET, Python. It does it does the Roslyn code compilation trick thing. This is this like the month of bindings? We talked about bindings just like 4 weeks ago or something, like making bindings easier. So no, another binding. So it does bindings. Okay, another box checked. And then you said performant. I'm like, what does performant mean? Well, mine was kind of performant, but this one's better. What are we talking about? Well, there is a cool thing called CSnakes by Tony
Baloney.
Okay, we'll go with Baloney.
It's Anthony Shaw, who is the cloud advocate for Python at Microsoft.
Okay, fantastic. So it's Tony Baloney's CSnakes. It is a fantastic library. I think we got to talk so many levels. I want to break this thing down because I think it's kind of fascinating how they solved the problem. But let's talk at the high level. You put Python code in your C# project, like in the CS proj. You reference some Python code.
It's in it.
Blah, blah, blah. Magic happens at compilation time, thanks to the magic of build tools and Roslyn and all that good stuff. Actually, I should check. Does this work with F#? We'll have to check Tony below.
It does. It
does. It does. Okay.
It does.
Very good. And that code generation, like you said, creates a binding to whatever global functions, not types, but global functions that you define. It handles classes in a weird way, but any global functions in the Python files that you define, it creates bindings, C# bindings that are fully typed because it does require type annotations for the binding part. But that's just the binding part. So that binding code, whatever code you have there, can go and reference all sorts of other, the ecosystem, as we like to say.
Yes.
So all that magic, and then with a little bit more magic, it obviously needs to go find Python on your machine. So with just a little bit more magic, not too much more, you have to point your app towards Python. And we can talk about how you would bundle this kind of thing, because it's a little tricky if you wanted to do this on mobile or something like that, but it would actually be possible. Anyway, so you put some Python stuff in your project, and you get to run some Python stuff, and it actually uses real Python. So it's creating a thin binding so it can communicate between the two worlds, but it's actually using the full Python, whatever you want to call it, interpreter.
Runtime.
Runtime, yep, all that stuff. And it's actually running real Python, and it's going as fast as little Python can go.
As fast as that Python could go. Yes, it's very true. Now, obviously, I think a cool part of this, and a lot of people worked on it besides just Anthony, but a good example of this is, let's say you wanted to use scikit, for example, which is a Python library that does all sorts of mathy, sciencey things, right?
Science things.
Yeah, science things. It's in the name. It's a scikit, and he has a sample in here, for example, of calculating the k-means and inertia together in calling this function, right? So instead of just saying, hey, I want to bind this entire library, it's using, a slim binding, if you will, right? Which is he, in the sample, defines, your method and then calls the function from that library. So it uses pip, it pulls in all the dependencies, everything that requires .text. And the reason for that is because again, C# to Python, right? Or, just like back in the day, Objective-C to C#, how does it map? How does stuff happen, right? There's things that don't make sense, like unions, right? Like Python, there's unions, how would you map that, right? How would it work, type of things. So he basically calls, takes some data, does some Python-y stuff to it, calls this method, returns a tuple back, right? And the tuple and the lists of floats, it knows how to do all the mapping and everything under the hood as well, which is really cool, like you're saying.
Yeah. It's funny that we've kind of settled on this method. Just like we were saying with the Swift bindings, you can access whatever libraries you want, but you really want to create for yourself, like a nice clean API for communicating between the two worlds. Yes, wouldn't it be nice if you could just call any function in any of those worlds? But life is a little more complicated than that. And it really, and honestly, it helps you to define this kind of slim API. It's honestly no different than what we were doing when we were creating our terrible web APIs. We were defining an API that we could talk to. And it was a simple API that communicated with basic things like lists, tuples, dictionaries. If you can't write an app with lists and dictionaries and tuples and numbers, then I don't know what even is your app. So I think they did actually a great job with that binding interface. It made me a little bit jealous. I'm like, well, why can't I just include a Swift file in my C# project and get this kind of like super? I mean, we were talking about the improvements to native library compilation in Maui, but be kind of nice. It'd be kind of nice to pull some tricks from CSnakes here. Good tricks.
Yeah, it's pretty neat, and I think the integration is really neat. And then I think also like they do handle, like I said, all the GC and all the threads as well. And I think even what's funny about this library, as we're talking about .NET 9 and things like that, is it actually already supports .NET 9 and some of the new like ML things like tensor spans, but it also supports Python 3.13, which is not out yet also. So it supports things that are in preview. And in 13.3, CPython has free threading mode, which like allows you to do a bunch of crazy threading stuff. But they already support it. They handle it. Frank, it's happening. Threads.
Yeah, I did notice you have to compile Python yourself to enable that. So I'm like, okay, I'm not going to touch that just yet. Let's do a quick fun deep dive and make fun of Python for a minute.
Yes.
The reason Python's a little bit slow is that they were never able to do multi-threading. That's because they just have a single-threaded model. That's just how the runtime works. And it works through this magical thing called a global interpreter lock, the GIL. And even this library, even CSnakes, has to talk to the GIL. So whenever you want to call a Python function from C#, especially if you want to like lock an object or something like that, it'll say, hey GIL, hey global interpreter lock, do its thing, and then exit the lock and do all that kind of stuff whenever it wants to execute its own code. So it's always been there. It's always been a pain because if you want to write multi-threaded Python code, you really can't. What you do instead is you write multi-process Python code, but then you got to talk between processes, and you're back to writing web APIs so the two processes can talk to each other. So it's always been a terrible world. So yes, it's always been the holy grail of getting rid of the global interpreter lock, but just so many libraries depend on it. It's just, years, momentum.
It's there.
Can you imagine? It's been a single-threaded runtime for decades, and now it's not going to be. Things are going to break that aren't ready for it. So you'll see a lot of libraries saying they require very specific things before that world. Anyway, it's cool they support it. Bravo. That's the benefit of actually talking to the Python runtime itself. They get all these fancy features right out of the gate.
Yeah, that was pretty fantastical. Well, you dove deeper into the implementation. Do you want to go into the CSnakes? Start slithering around?
I did. I got curious because when you first sent this to me, I wasn't really sure what it was because there's a lot of ways to solve this problem. And we just talked about their solution. They create a thin binding. They actually communicate with Python. But I didn't know that. You just send me links. You leave it for me to discover, James.
That's the best way to do it.
Implementation.
It's your own exploration. You'll figure it out. You're a smart guy.
So I was personally curious, what is this doing? Because there's different ways you can run Python on .NET. You can take Python code and you can recompile it as IL, like Iron Python. You just write a compiler for Python and you generate .NET. Another way is you cheat a little bit. You have the Python interpreter output some kind of C language like version of the code, and then you compile that. Lots of little tricks. I was curious what this was doing. turns out it's doing what we were doing before, but that binding interface, I'm like, okay, how's it binding then? So they had a runtime. You dive into it. There is a CSnakes runtime, and it's a beautiful, nice, simple .NET binding to the Python runtime. We're not binding to your code at this point. It's a binding to the Python runtime, so you can talk to the Python runtime, talk to the GIL, talk to all the different things, and tell it to do fun things. But what is that shim? What is that fun little API? And it turns out these crazy people, Tony Bellotti, you wrote a parser. They're parsing the Python. I was also curious. Okay, I'm like, okay, at some point you got to parse some Python. How are they going to parse this Python? There are official Python parsers written in Python. A little bit of a chicken and egg problem. You can solve it. It's not that big a deal.
Yeah.
But they chose not to use the Python parser, and they decided to write their own parser. And I think maybe it's like Merge Conflict episode number 20 or something. You let me just rattle on about how to write parsers and things like that. It was wonderful. I don't know. It was a very long time ago. I love parsers. I love writing parsers. And I love it when people write parsers. And these crazy people didn't use the parser library, but wrote their own parser. Not from scratch. We can talk about that too. But I thought that was pretty cool. Good on you. Good. Everyone, write more parsers.
Well, that's cool. I mean, you also kind of gave a little bit of a definition of how does it compare to like IronPython or Python.net, for example, as there are other ways of doing Python-y things, right? And this is, similar and yet different, right? Like, yes, Python.net is a wrapper on the Python C API, but this does come with the source generators and the interop layer to automatically like handle the communication between the two as well, right? And IronPython, like you said, is a .NET implementation of Python that runs on the .NET runtime, which is pretty different in general.
Yeah, pretty different. And then if you dig around my GitHub, you'll see I've ported MicroPython, which is an alternative Python runtime. There are several Python runtimes out there, in fact. And MicroPython is one of the alternatives. It's small, easy to compile. And I've recompiled that for .NET. So it's a native .NET library, 0 dependencies, and it runs Python code. So, there's a lot of ways to run Python code. This one I like a lot because, for example, to compare and contrast, my version, my MicroPython, although it knows all the syntax of Python and can technically execute Python, it can't run any big libraries or anything. It doesn't have TensorFlow there. It doesn't have PyTorch there. It doesn't have the ecosystem is not there. The language is there, but how much is a language without its ecosystem? And it turns out not too much. You really have to build up that ecosystem to make it worthwhile, to make it useful. Even the base Python SDK, whatever you want to call it, comes with a whole bunch of libraries. And so whenever you want to have a Python thing, you always had this problem of bundling all those libraries. That's why I really like the CSnakes approach, which is really just point us at your Python, and then we'll just use that. We're not going to get into the whole bundling thing. Just that's roughly how this thing works. Point it at a Python, it'll go from there.
Yeah, and I like that it's like pointed at the dependencies, do all this stuff, and it just kind of works, which is neat. Now, we had talked about newer versions of Aspire as well, and people might be saying, well, didn't Python support come to Aspire? Well, it's orchestrator support for like Python apps. So if you have a Python app, like your web app, right, like your Python web server, you can make that part of your Aspire orchestrator, and it would spin it up, and you can share variables, right? This would literally be, hey, I have a backend and a front end in an Aspire project, and I want that backend API to literally call Python code right now when my front end calls it, right? So my front end is going to call it .NET API, and that .NET API is going to invoke Python on the server, right? And what's cool about that is that can all be Aspire-ified, and they can use you could use open telemetry in the Python thing, and you can share variables and stuff, and it would all be in the stack trace, which is kind of cool. So I wanted to declare those two things, right? As they seem similar, but they're actually very different.
Yeah, this is very much, I have a .NET web server, probably. This is probably its biggest use case.
Yeah.
It would be fun to get this working on mobile, though.
It would be cool.
Yeah. I have a .NET web server, and there's just some Python code I want to run because, it's there. In fact, I have a perfect use case for this that I'm 100% going to do. Hold me to it. I have my magic AI thermostat running my house. It's just always doing its thing. And it's lovely. I wrote it in ML.NET, and ML.NET is very powerful. But I am much better at AI stuff in Python and PyTorch and TensorFlow, that world. And I know I can make a much better model because I'm just better in that world. I have a higher skill level in that world. And so I'm really excited because now I can finally do a better... Okay, my thermostat's been great. Full honesty, I'm not even exaggerating. It's great. Turns out humans are really predictable. But I'm really excited to be able to actually just make my model in Python and just have my .NET web server, my .NET everything. It's running everything through .NET. I don't want to run multiple servers. That's complicated. So I'm just going to jam the Python in there, and it's going to run, and I'm going to be so happy. So much easier.
Well, and I was talking to Anthony, and what he told me, because he was going through a demo with me, is that if you're on Windows, some people are like, oh, I need to set up, my Python environment and do all this other stuff. Actually, on Windows, Python's actually shipped it as a NuGet package. Did you know that? Steve Dower ships it as a NuGet.
I learned it 1 hour ago, James, as I was digging through I'm like, okay, well, they were going through all the ways that you can point it at Python. I keep eliding over that because honestly, it's boring, but, point it at a directory. That's the best one. Point it at a directory.
And go, yeah.
But alternatively, there's a NuGet out there. And so there's a link to a NuGet that's just called Python. And I'm like, what's in here? So I actually had to download it, rename it to a zip, crack that puppy open, and see, what is in here? You know what's in there? Python.
Python, it's in there. It's in the name. It's in the name. It's Python.
Compile for Windows. I really wish they would just throw a Mac version in there.
I bet you could.
Just do it. Just do it.
I bet.
It's really cool. All you lucky Windows people, go do that. Us primitive Unix people will just keep pointing it at directories or something for now. But actually, I think I use Windows Azure server, so maybe I'll be a little bit lucky and just do a NuGet reference, and life will be good.
Seems kind of cool.
I don't know how I'll test it though.
So what else is in here? One thing too, I think that's neat about this library is we talked about performance, right, and the low level and how this thing is working. One thing that's really unique and that I was talking to Anthony about that I figured more about, which is how it's handling different data types to be a lot faster. So for example, in NumPy, for example, they've integrated deep integration with spans and tensor spans in .NET 9 to basically make it so it has no overhead of these types of objects. I don't know any of those words that I just said because I read it off the page. What does that mean, Frank?
This is really cool. Actually, this is what got me thinking about my home AI thing because when you're talking to AIs, we're always talking through these large matrices called tensors, just multidimensional matrices. We put all our numbers in these giant matrices and we talk to each other with all these tensors. And so transporting those things around efficiently is important. A, because they're huge. B, because you do a lot of them. So it's important that they're efficient. And what does it mean to be efficient? It means not copying them all the time. Every time you want to bounce between the Python world and the .NET world, you just don't want to be copying. And even then, the bounce is even trickier because it's the Python world talking to the C world, and we're talking from the .NET world to the Python world to the C world. So you really want all of that to happen with no copies. And so I haven't dug into the code that far, but I assume that that's what they mean by their use of spans, because that's .NET's magical way to map to raw memory without copying it. You can still reference it, pass your spans around, have fun. And then the tensor library, I think we've talked about a few of the .NET tensor libraries on the podcast. They're just cool. The annoying thing about the tensor libraries is mostly just interfaces. And so this is like fulfilling the interface. So they're implementing the tensor with magical, hopefully zero copy tensors. Hopefully that's what the format means.
That's what it says. It says, yes, CSnakes supports the Python buffer protocol for bytes and byte array. It is a low-level interface for reading and writing raw bytes from Python objects. And then they do a bunch of read-only and read-write spans, and it does buffery stuff to basically make that stuff happen, which is wild.
Yeah, the hardest part there, like it really is just buffers, so it's just pointers in the end. That part is simple. The hard part is the memory management, because like you just got to make sure everyone's, Python's a garbage collected language. They can move things around in memory, just like in .NET. We're allowed to move things around in memory, so you have to pin them. Everyone's got to be pinned. Global interpreter locks have to be locked. Crazy things like that. And it sounds like they just handle all that for you, which is lovely.
So what do you think, Frank? It sounds like you already have a weekend hack project going on that you'll report back next week.
1 week, that's all I get? Yes, I will 100% have that done in 1 week. Here's the deal. I am 100% going to do it. I will try for 1 week. I know I can't stop myself by also trying to see if I can bundle it at all for iOS.
That would be great. And more importantly, if like the Python Nougat package could just like build other distros, like that'd be pretty cool. So I'm just saying.
Just saying. But that sounds like multiple days of work, so we'll see.
That'd be awesome. All right. Anything else you want to say about the CSnakes? I think it's pretty neat.
No, thank you. It really was Frank bait. This is right up my alley. I do feel a little bit bad. I hope everyone else found this enjoyable. I found it enjoyable. Hopefully my enthusiasm came through, and you weren't too bored listening to me talk about parsers. Because, oh, by the way, the parser library they use, it's really cool. It's called Superpower. Everyone, it doesn't matter. Go use it. I've never seen it before. It's got a wonderful name called Superpower. It looks like a wonderful way to write peg parsers. Go get it.
I love it. Go get it, people. Oh my goodness. All right. Yeah, we'll give it a look. And as Frank dives deeper, let us know if you want more Python goodness in your life. And it's C# goodness. I think that's the cool part. It's like, for me, not a Python person, but I sure sometimes would like to sprinkle a little Python in there. So go check it out if this is you and you're in that case. All right, that's going to do it for this week's Python filled and Copilot filled merge conflict. So until next week, I'm James Montemagno.
And I'm Frank Kruger. Thanks for watching and listening.
Peace.